Hey guys, it's Vanessa. I'm here to do a wrap-up of the leftovers that I read before Booktubeathon, as well as what I did end up finishing during Booktubeathon. So leftovers. In my last wrap-up, I, for some reason, completely missed Lucy Knisley's Something New. This is Lucy Knisley's newest work and focuses primarily on her planning her wedding and going through with the wedding. This book made me so happy when I was reading it, and I found it to be really sweet. I also thought it was Lucy Knisley at her best when it comes to asking questions about herself and being introspective. Most of this had to do with her being a feminist but also wanting to plan a wedding, meeting those two things where she's not going over the top in this institution that has not necessarily had a great feminist past, but she also sees the great in it of getting families together and, you know, coming together with a partner and deciding we're going to give each other for the rest of our lives. So it's kind of her balancing those two things and asking herself these questions of the reasons why she's getting married and what she does in the actual wedding that give little feminist touches that make it a little bit more equal of a, I want to say transaction, but I guess that makes it seem not like a feminist thing. But it's kind of her husband and her coming together and making little tweaks to their wedding to make it be more equal for themselves. She also included a photograph from her actual planning and wedding day, and I found that to be a really nice touch that made the cartoon her and the real her kind of come together. I really lost myself in this, and I read it all in one sitting pretty much, and I just really loved it. I definitely understand the criticisms that are out there about Lucy Knisley and her work, but overall I go to it to just learn about a person. I just want to learn about Lucy's life and what she's up to. Towards the end of this book, what occurred is basically going to be probably the inspiration for her next graphic memoir, so I'm excited to get to that one when it comes out. Another thing that I read right before Booktubeathon, which was on my Booktubeathon TBR, but I didn't technically read it during Booktubeathon, is Best State Ever by Dave Barry. This was a really fun read about my home state, Florida. Dave Barry went to really iconic places like the Everglades and like Club Live, the coolest club in Miami, and like the Villages, which is one of the biggest residential areas for retired people from all over the country. So it was just really fun seeing him take on those experiences and what he took from them and the way that he poked fun at everything. So it was a really lighthearted book. It was definitely what I needed in that moment. It was quick, pleasurable, and it made me giggle, which was all I was asking of it. So on to my Booktubeathon reads. The first thing that I read was The K. I wanted to read because it was a book I owned and also because it was a book that I wanted to reread. It was a very special book to me during my childhood. I want to say in like 5th grade. This was like the epitome of like the best stories ever. It focuses on a shipwreck that occurs with a young white boy who has been raised to believe that black people are inferior, being shipwrecked in this island with a West Indies man named Timothy, who proves to him in his time there that obviously you shouldn't judge someone by the color of their skin. And that's the whole message of this book. So it was a very important book to me as a child, but upon rereading it, I felt it was very simple in its message. What I really enjoyed about it was the stuck on the island and the Caribbean feel to it, because it's not something that you read typically in books. But I didn't really enjoy the way that questions about race were really grazed. I think for children it got the message across, but for someone who's rereading this and hoping for like a middle grade book that like transcends and is also for an older audience, I didn't think that it really got there, and it didn't give me a satisfying conclusion. It was very abrupt and quick at the end. I understand this book was published in 1969 and that should be taken into account, but it's kind of sad when you reread a book and you think it's really great and it's not as great as you remember it. The next thing that I read was Sweet Tooth Volume 5. I thought that this was really interesting in the first 3 sections. There was a change of pace and a change of story, trying to go back to the origin of what Sweet Tooth is all about. And the art was actually really different too. It had more of a watercolor, rustic look to it. But then when we got away from that origin story and went back to the main gang and seeing what they were up to, the things that happened with them were really predictable and were not as good as the first 4 volumes. So that was also a little bit of a disappointment. So my beginning part of Booktubeathon hadn't been going very well. I thought everything that I was reading was mostly okay. The next thing that I read after that was Iggie's House. This book proves to me that Judy Blume basically has written a book about every issue that you could think a young teenage girl could go through or a young girl could go through. I really like that about Judy Blume. I like that she takes on different kinds of issues, not just the same typical issues you would find. In this one, she tackles racism in housing and in the neighborhood that the main character lives in. There's a new family that moves in to the house of her old best friend, and she notices after trying to become friends with them and hanging out with them that there are other people in the neighborhood that are not as receptive and do not want this new black family moving in to be in that neighborhood. I felt this book really used the naivete of the main character Winnie really well. She's very strong in her opinions. She's not going to take no for an answer. Obviously, she doesn't grasp these concepts completely, and there are moments in the book when the neighbors do check Winnie and let her know, like, what we're going through is nothing that you could ever imagine. Like, you're not in our shoes. That there was still conflict between the kids. It wasn't just like Winnie against the older neighbors. I thought that it was very realistic in that way. She questioned her parents as well and their stand, and to see if she could get them to change their mind and to get other people in the neighborhood to change their mind. I've read some criticisms about this book, and I think that they are warranted. This book could have been completely different if it had been from the point of view of any of the new three neighbors, and that would have been a great book too. Judy Blume wrote this book in like the 70s. Reading this today in 2017, I still felt that it was realistic to our day. That's one, sad, and two, indicative of how great Judy Blume is at writing stories, and how her stories, all of them that I've read so far, which have been published in the 70s or 80s, feel like they could be stories told today about young girls. So I really value that in Judy Blume, and she's one of those authors that I really respect and that I want to keep reading. The next thing that I read was The Female of the Species. This book was described to me originally as very raw, and that the voice of the main character Alex was very unique. I came away really impressed by Mindy McGuinness as an author and her overall writing abilities, the way that she creates her plot, and the way that she had these three main POV characters tell different sides of this one story, and it tackled such important subjects such as rape and rape culture, violence against women, the idea that boys will be boys, molestation, and slut-shaming, all in a subdued manner, which I really appreciate in young adult fiction and in fiction in general, that still drove home all the messages she was intending to drive. I felt she really punctured me with all these truths that really explained and described and showed to us what it's like to be a young woman today in a way that wasn't like knocking you over the head with the messages. So this book I thought was really great and really well done. I listened to it on audiobook, and I would recommend the audiobook as well. I just want more young adult fiction like this, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I also want to say that I agree with the hype here. For the most part, it really lived up to that hype. The next thing that I read was a poetry collection titled Egghead by Bo Burnham. This was a comedy poetry collection, and I felt that it was really hit or miss, to be honest. I think he's really funny in real life, and I also don't know if this kind of funny poetry could ever be funny to me. I don't know if it can ever really be done well. I definitely chuckled a few times, and I did tab maybe 10 poems, but the fact that there were more than 50 probably in here and I didn't laugh out loud once, I think tells you that maybe this comedy poetry style does not work for me. If you have any suggestions that can prove me otherwise, that would be great, but this one just didn't do it for me. The next thing that I read was Understanding Comics. This teaches us a bunch of lessons about comics and graphic novels. It's really fascinating, especially if you're interested in the topic. Overall, it discusses the power of the cartoon phase to create a connection between us and the characters. It also discusses the way panels are created, why lines look differently and what they mean, and speech bubbles as well. It also discusses the difference between Western styles and Eastern styles, kind of the trajectory of why over time they have been evolving differently. For me, it gave me a light ding Maybe this is why I don't like Eastern styles as much. And it also describes a lot of comics history that went really, really far back and trying to define what comics is in general. It was originally published in the early 1990s. I think it would be good to have a revision or a new one come out that takes into account how much comics have changed in that time, because I think there's been really a boom in the past 15 years. I also thought this was a little bit dull and dry at times, which was not as entertaining or fun to read. This is something that should technically be like a day's reading, but it took me about 2 or 3 days to finish it just because I was not that passionate about picking it up and opening it. And overall, I liked this, but I didn't love it. Last but not least, I'll talk about the last book that I read. I started it during Booktubeathon, but I didn't finish it until a week or so afterward. And it's Euphoria by Lily King. I really have some mixed emotions about this book. I really liked a lot of aspects of it. I quite loved the inspiration of this book and the focus of anthropology as a profession and following these professionals doing this work in the early days of anthropology. That was fascinating to me. And to be with these different tribes as well and to see how they viewed different facts of life and how their traditions mirrored that. I also loved many of the discussions and themes that King tackles, like can anthropology ever be objective? And furthermore, can any of us ever be objective? We have our own way of viewing the world, and all of our experiences really inform that worldview, so how can we look at anything really objectively? We really can't. I also really enjoyed looking at these tribes and what these traditions mean to these tribes. The anthropologists kind of trying to make meanings of these traditions, whether they really had meanings or not. I think my problems with this novel stemmed from my disinterest in picking it up. I had a really hard time being like, yeah, I really want to be reading that. Let me open it and read. I had problems too because I would only read like 15 pages at a time and then just close it. That probably hurt me too. Like if I had just read 50 pages at once, maybe that could have helped me. It was really difficult for me to care about the love triangle as well. It's not really a love triangle, but like the give and take between the different relationships that are going on there between the three main anthropologists. I didn't really care about them, and I didn't care about their relationships with each other. I kind of like them separately, but I don't really know if I like them together. I kind of wish we were elsewhere. Like I wish we were more stuck on the profession. Let's learn more about these tribes. Let's learn more about their traditions, and let's create characters around these tribes members than just ruminating between the three main characters. I wanted something different when I went into this, and it just didn't live up to the expectations that I had for it. I really thought that I would like the triangle, to be honest, and I didn't care about these people. So that is it for this wrap up. I will be back soon with 9 more things that I read. I hope that you've been having a great reading week. I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.